It's difficult to conceive that the past few years of your life have been spent with potential deceivers and betrayers. It's incredibly hard to grasp. I believed that I had established a solid and dependable marriage, that I had a true friendship, and that overall I was surrounded by close associates. However, it turned out not to be the case. Everyone was concealing something from me, and ultimately everyone will face consequences for it. Couples began to show up at my home almost 30 minutes late, despite my request for them to arrive by this evening. It appeared that each pair was timing their arrival to avoid being the earliest. Consequently, 2 couples' vehicles arrived in my driveway around 25 to 7, my father's truck with him, and my stepmother Mama Khan arrived just 5 minutes later. As I was still in the living room, questioning Larry and Angela Klug, and Roy and Mary Jo Chastain about their beverage preferences, Dad and Mama Connie entered through the front door without knocking, as was their usual habit. While I was preparing drinks for the initial 2 couples, Dad went to the kitchen, took 2 beers from my refrigerator for himself and Mama, and joined me as I served the others their drinks. I had already popped open a Bud Black Crown when my visitors began to arrive. After ensuring everyone was settled, I sat in my armchair facing them. Across the coffee table, except for Dad and Mama Connie, who sat near the piano to my right, the discussion was limited to basic pleasantries and exchanging scant information about drink choices, along with expressions of appreciation. However, the intense emotions of sadness, grief, anger, and shame stemming from the present predicament with myself, my family, and friends made engaging in casual conversation challenging. There was no discussion about children, social activities, or work, especially not about marriages, notably mine. You see, this morning my wife Jamie received divorce papers at her office due to adultery. Her response was not like the desperate calls one might anticipate in such circumstances. It seems that after observing 2 pictures of her and Doug Stevenson in compromising situations, as well as transcripts of their dialogues obtained through my private investigator, she recognized the magnitude of her unfaithfulness. Jamie had decided to follow my written directives by collecting the bags I had prepared and left on the front porch, containing necessities for her temporary move. My grandfather had bequeathed me sole ownership of the house upon his demise 6 years before our marriage, and I had altered the locks after she departed for work this morning. In writing, I informed Jamie that I had stored the rest of her possessions, along with most of our previously shared items, in a storage facility on East Brainerd Road, just east of downtown Chattanooga. I hadn't heard from her except for a note she evidently left in my storm door when I returned this afternoon, merely stating I'm sorry. The room grew silent as soon as I spoke, and all eyes turned toward me, absorbing my words. I had my attorney arrange for Jamie to be served with divorce papers at her office this morning. I didn't express it loudly or with any discernible anger in my tone, yet the impact was significant, akin to a loudly declared proclamation. Conversation stopped, and everyone looked at me for a moment, even movement halted. I was sure that news of my actions had reached the 2 wives, and likely the husbands too, before I spoke a word. I focused my gaze toward a central point, avoiding direct eye contact with anyone, ignoring the expressions on their faces. It didn't matter to me whether anyone exhibited awareness, shock, surprise, innocence, or none of those emotions. Tonight's gathering wasn't primarily to announce the end of my 6-year marriage to Jamie, but rather to outline my immediate future moving forward, as politicians in Washington like to phrase it to suggest that their actions are leading towards some sort of positive outcome. It's a vacuous phrase crafted by Washington think tanks. Clint, my father, finally broke the silence after about 5 seconds, asking if there was anything Jamie and I could have done before serving her papers, or perhaps even now, when I paused to respond, wrestling with my anger and frustration over multiple unfolding scenarios. This evening, Mary Jo Chastain, being naturally the most sociable of the group, commented, "Mr. Hood, knowing your son as well as I do, I'm certain he weighed all the options before making a move towards Jamie." She tenderly placed her free hand on Roy's arm as he silently mulled over her words. Under different circumstances, I might have valued Mary Jo's recognition of my skill in handling complex emotions. But not tonight. Just 3 months ago, Clint, Roy said to me, agreeing with my observation, "It certainly looks like a secretive meeting from my angle as well. Roy and I were having a beer together after watching one of the many basketball games on the big screens at Buffalo Wild Wings. I had just commented on what seemed like covert activity in a distant corner. She, a bottle blonde in her early 30s, had entered the bar about an hour earlier with two other women. He, a man in his late 30s, dressed in a sharp suit and wingtip shoes clearly misplaced in a sports bar, had arrived alone just 10 minutes before. Given how quickly he had made his way to the corner of the room after getting his drink at the bar, and how swiftly she had left her group to join him in his secluded spot, it was obvious that they had either planned this meeting beforehand or had done it before, or maybe both. Noticing the rings on their respective left hands, it was apparent they were married, and other signs strongly implied they were not married to each other. "Hey, Roy," I asked, reflecting on the recent shifts I had noticed in Jim's affection and interaction with me, which were certainly not improving. "What would you do if you recognized one or both of these cheating individuals while out like this? I mean, of course, there's the risk of telling the betrayed spouse and causing the one you inform to become angry and hostile, but don't you think the deceived husband, in the case of the cheating wife, or the deceived wife, in the case of the cheating husband, deserves to know?" Roy, not originally from Tennessee, had moved from New York after finishing his studies at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute and securing a job at the Department of Energy in Oak Ridge National Laboratory. Later, he left ORNL and settled in Chattanooga when he was hired by a local engineering firm 4 years ago. Our acquaintance began shortly after Roy and Mary Jo moved, at a book signing our wives had dragged us to at the local Barnes & Noble. We found out we were neighbors, exchanged dinner invitations, and Jamie and I welcomed them into our group of compatible couples among mutual friends. Having known Roy for several years now and recognizing his persistent New Yorker characteristics, I wasn't particularly surprised by his response. "Nah, too many complications." Besides, the truth always comes out eventually in such matters. Why risk spoiling a good friendship with a lasting bad memory? So I countered, "You're suggesting you'd just stand by and say nothing? What if it involved the spouse of a dear friend? Wouldn't that mean something?" Roy twirled his glass on the small elevated table where we were enjoying our wings and drinks, contemplating his answer. Eventually he said, "Well, I suppose if it were a close friend, someone I genuinely cared about, not just a work buddy or someone from our social circles, I might reconsider and feel compelled to inform the poor guy." I chuckled at how much of a southern influence Roy's wife, Mary Jo, seemed to be having on him, nudging him to soften his rigid stay-out-of-it attitude, ingrained in his upbringing in the Red Hook neighborhood of Brooklyn. I questioned, "You'd want to be told if it were Mary Jo, wouldn't you?" "Never going to happen," he replied sharply, then took a quick sip and slammed his glass down on the table, showing his annoyance at me merely for considering the possibility that his loyal wife could be unfaithful. "Relax, buddy," I reassured him. "We're just speculating here. You know I'm not accusing anyone. I just want to know that my friends would have my back if they ever noticed Jamie engaging in any inappropriate behavior behind my back. You get what I'm saying?" At the mention of the old Ernest P. Worrell commercials with Jim Varney, Roy chuckled and his earlier hostile attitude toward my comments eased. I smiled along with him, pretending that everything was joyful and bright, but inside, a growing darkness loomed that I couldn't conceal much longer. After I disclosed my plans to have Jamie served today and received concise responses from Dad and Mary Jo, silence settled for a few more moments until I spoke again. "I've also initiated legal proceedings against her objectionable boss by serving him with papers accusing him of alienation of affections. Additionally, I have requested another set of documents to be dispatched to the local vice president of their company concerning non-compliance with the company's policy on inappropriate intimacy between employees who are married to others." I paused momentarily to gather my thoughts before continuing, determined to maintain my flow and not ruin the surprise I had planned. His mood noticeably deteriorated, especially when faced with evidence from my private investigator confirming that many of his employees, including some in managerial positions, were aware of my wife's ongoing affair with her supervisor but chose to stay silent, merely gossiping about it among themselves in the break room. My expression undoubtedly turned grimmer as my anger escalated, both at the memory of what had happened and the extent of collusion among my wife's co-workers in her affair. Sensing the tension, the other couples in my living room wisely remained silent, allowing me to express my feelings without interruption. Interestingly, alienation of affections lawsuits aren't allowed anymore in Tennessee. However, because I had photographic evidence and eyewitness accounts proving that Jamie and that man shared a room in Charlotte, North Carolina during a legitimate business trip 3 months ago. The judge in Mecklenburg County, which includes Charlotte, permitted my lawyer to pursue the case from there. It appears the locals there receive a portion of the legal fees from such suits, regardless of the outcome I noted. Clint, you must really hold a strong grudge against that company to go to such lengths for a lawsuit, remarked Larry. Oh, it's deeper than that, my friend, I replied, seething yet aware that tonight would mark a significant and permanent change in several relationships. I retrieved a leather-bound folder from the coffee table, extracting a manila envelope from within. After verifying it bore the correct mark, I casually slid it across the table towards Roy. Roy took the envelope, exchanging looks with his wife before asking, "What's this, Clint?" "Have a look," Roy, I replied calmly, deliberately controlling my emotions to resist the urge to confront him and his disrespectful wife. As he opened the flap and examined the contents, his eyes widened and his mouth opened in shock as he started to breathe rapidly. "I'm serving you, friends," I said calmly, though I felt like shouting at him. "Are you insane?" Roy, he exclaimed, trying to regain his composure. "Roy, dear," Mary Jo interjected, now sitting upright, concerned about her husband's reaction to what he was reading. Roy, too upset to respond to his wife, glared at me. So I explained, "This is a formal notice of my intention to file a lawsuit under North Carolina law for alienation of affections against Mrs. Mary Jo Chastain for, and I quote, malicious conduct that contributed to or caused the loss of affection." Those are the words. And they state that as a direct and proximate result of the negligent, wrongful, and reckless misconduct and behavior of Mrs. Mary Jo Chastain, the plaintiff that would be me, has suffered damage to the affection and consortium with my wife. In simpler terms, I continued before the previously perplexed, now visibly angry Mary Jo could speak. You, Mary Jo, were aware of what was happening, having received a first-hand account from my wife, and chose to conceal it, perhaps even endorse it, without informing me. You despicable person, Mary Jo retorted, now fully composed. Alienation of affections. I am not her lover. Serve these papers to that man, Doug. She's been involved with, she protested. I stared at her, my face etched with bitterness, and spoke directly. Mary Jo, were you aware that Jamie and I were in love before she became involved with Doug? Mary Jo looked confused by my question, but she nodded and, eager to express her opinion, replied, "Yes, you two were genuinely sweet to each other. It was evident you were in love, however." I interrupted her and persisted. "Has the love Jamie and I shared as spouses been compromised, strained, or even destroyed because of her relationship with that man?" Doug. Mary Jo sighed and reluctantly admitted, "I suppose so," but I continued, "So by not informing me, along with Doug's direct actions by engaging in inappropriate behavior with her, you are contributing to the loss of Jamie's and my affection, or becoming the cause of it. You were aware, or should have been aware, that Jamie's interaction with Doug would lead to a rift between her and me." "Listen," Clint, Roy interjected, now defending his wife, "you need to face reality here. We've been friends for a couple of years. You're accusing us of being the villains here, when it was your wife and her boss who—" Mary Jo, growing agitated, cut off her husband. "Regardless, you can't substantiate your claims about any of this. And as you mentioned, there's no law in Tennessee covering this." I retorted with a deliberately patronizing tone and expression, "But as I mentioned earlier, there is tort law for this in North Carolina." Mary Jo hesitated, gathering her thoughts for her next rebuttal. Before she could respond, I added, "Remember the girls' week in Nag's Head?" I arched my eyebrows as I spoke. Mary Jill paused, her eyes narrowing as she tried to recollect the trip she took with my wife Jamie, their friend Angela Klug, who was now seated beside her, and even my own stepmother, Mamak Connie. "Jamie and I own a timeshare condo in CMI, Florida. Note to self: need to nudge my lawyer to have Jamie take the timeshare in the settlement, since those things are otherwise too hard to get rid of. We also belong to a timeshare swap consortium that allows us to trade our vacation week at our place in CMI for the use of another unit at one of the consortium's member resorts elsewhere in the US. Just about 3 months ago, right after she and Doug had begun to do the nasty, Jamie, my wife, had arranged a girls' week at a resort in Duck, North Carolina, on the Outer Banks. All of the small communities in that area are referred to collectively by the locals as Nag's Head. Jamie, along with Mary Jo and Angela, had arranged their vacations to allow them to go together. At the 11th hour, I suggested to Jamie that she bring my stepmother along, hoping for some additional adult supervision. I was increasingly worried about Jamie's behavior and her inappropriate relationship with her boss. The private investigator had already been on the case for at least 2 weeks by then. And I was anxious about Jamie's behavior when she was away from me for a week, even with her peers. Ma'am Connie, who doesn't have a job outside her and Dad's home, agreed to accompany the younger women. "What about Nag's Head?" Mary Jo inquired. Instead of directly responding to her, I lifted my hand holding the remote control for our cutting-edge stereo entertainment system. With a single click, I conveyed the information I'd acquired from my private investigator, complete with authentic audio accompaniment. I had requested the transcript of the forthcoming playback to be included in the packet I gave to Roy. However, the conversational evidence gained a sense of authenticity when heard directly from the source. I prefaced the forthcoming audio with, "This recording was captured from the neighboring vacation condo's patio, separated by a privacy fence, using a high-quality parabolic microphone." The recording then played, capturing the sounds of the seashore, passing cars, and occasional noises from children at the pool in the adjacent condo. "Mary Jo, you're not really engaging in that behavior, are you?" Jamie, "Oh, we are. It's just that being with Doug feels exhilarating and naughty. I know it's temporary. I'll engage in this forbidden affair and then it will end soon. I'll stay devoted to Clint forever, Mary Jo." "Until the next temptation, you mean, Jamie?" "No, there won't be a next time. This is a one-time thing, trust me, girlfriend. Once I end it with Doug, or he ends it first, that's it. I'll refocus, stop taking birth control, and Clint and I can start building our family as we've planned, Mary Jo. I'm just surprised, Jamie, this isn't like you." I couldn't betray Roy like that. He'd feel humiliated, angry, and question his manhood compared to the other guy I'd be cheating with. "Oh no, Clint is a much better partner, both emotionally and physically, than Doug. It's just the thrill of the situation and the novelty, I suppose, and the excitement of being a little naughty before settling down with Clint for the rest of my life, which might not last long if he discovers Jamie." "You're not planning to betray me, are you, Mary Jo?" Mary Jo, letting out a sigh audible, even from the distance of the fence and 15 feet away, according to the Pi's microphone. "No, I won't betray you, but I'm not going to actively lie either, understand?" I pressed the remote, halting the playback as the excerpt of their conversation from weeks ago in North Carolina played. I observed Mary Jo's expression darken, while Roy grew more hostile. "You despicable person," Roy exclaimed. "You had no authority to spy on and record my wife. I should take legal action against you for invading our privacy." "Enough," I said. "As Ronald Reagan stated during the Republican primary debates in 1980, I paid for this microphone. Additionally, I was the rightful owner of the timeshare swap. Furthermore, suspecting Jamie of infidelity, I purchased a second resort week which I assigned to my private investigator. Hence, he had full legitimacy to be present and record the nature sounds of the beach. It's unfortunate that my unfaithful soon-to-be ex-wife and your wife, who was all too willing to cover for an adulterer, happened to converse while my Pi was testing his equipment on the adjacent patio of our vacation unit." I leaned back and paused briefly before continuing, and the judge in Charlotte was quite understanding of my situation, considering that conversation also occurred in North Carolina. Roy was visibly furious now. "Well, you can just take these papers and shove them up your ass, but I'm not allowing you to drag my wife into court and publicly humiliate her, even if it does happen in Charlotte." I grinned and retrieved another hefty envelope, pushing it across the table toward him. "Oh, she won't be the only one facing public embarrassment." Bud Roy angrily grabbed the second envelope, nearly tearing it open to reveal its contents. Within seconds, he was on his feet, spitting out his words, "You son of a, you must be out of your mind, you've been served too, fool." I replied as calmly as I could, though my anger towards Roy and his involvement in the situation was boiling beneath the surface, something he was about to discover. "What do you mean by intentional infliction of emotional distress?" Roy yelled. I grinned at him and remarked, "Essentially, in states where alienation of affections lawsuits aren't permitted, they often allow for legal action under intentional infliction of emotional distress -die.e.d. laws, and Tennessee is among them. This is where I take legal action against you for what's termed outrageous conduct with the intent to cause, or reckless disregard for the likelihood of causing emotional distress to the plaintiff. That's me, and that the plaintiff suffers severe or extreme emotional distress, and that the defendant's outrageous conduct is the actual and proximate cause of the emotional distress. You being the defendant, you jerk. Emotional distress encompasses mental suffering, anguish, and all other highly unpleasant mental responses, including fear, nervousness, grief, anxiety, worry, embarrassment, shock, humiliation, and indignity, as well as physical pain. Trust me. My lawyer and I have thoroughly reviewed this, and I've studied it extensively. When have I ever done anything remotely like that to you? You jerk, Roy yelled. I raised the remote once more and suggested, how about meeting at the wagon wheel where you know I'm a regular? I anticipated that Mary Jo, being as outspoken as she is, would at least reveal details about Jamie's affair, so I had the Pi monitor both of you in your discussions about me. With a click of the remote, the sound system emitted the bustling ambience of a bar, allowing us all to hear Roy's distinct Tennessee-infused New York accent fill the room. The recorded conversation suggested that Roy had been dominating the discussion. Roy: yeah, she's off having an affair with her boss, while the clueless guy is at home, content in his ignorance. Mary Jo: Roy, please. I promised Jamie we wouldn't reveal her. If you don't stop. Another man, and your friend is named Clint, right? Clint Hood. The guy who hangs out here a few times a week. Roy: yep, that's him. He joins me and some buddies for darts and pool every now and then. He's really a friend, a foolish one, but still a friend. It's amusing to have him around to beat at golf and gossip about while his wife and her boss take advantage of him. In response, the audio prompted the bar patrons to burst into mocking laughter. I pressed the remote and turned to him. Well, buddy, I suppose I must be quite the entertainment to have around and mock in a crowd where I'm rather well known, given how much time I used to spend there in my leisure. Well, I used to. Now, thanks to Jamie's actions and your big mouth. I'll have to find a new spot to hang out where I can enjoy a beer, some pool, and darts alongside any new friends I might come across after I take legal action against you and sever ties as a friend. Oh, that's right, I added with a sardonic grin. I've already taken care of that. I presented another document and unclasped it. This is the initial report from a therapist my lawyer arranged for me to see last week, I explained. It asserts quite conclusively that I'm experiencing emotional distress in various forms: mental anguish, grief, anxiety, humiliation, and indignity, all contributing to the onset of acid reflux, which serves as evidence of the deterioration of my physical health. Roy and Mary Jo stood up, visibly angry and embarrassed, but said nothing. Speaking quietly to them, I added, feel free to leave, and I'll see you in court. Roy, still trembling with anger, watched as Mary Jo collected the documents they had been given. She gently touched his elbow, and they exchanged looks. She mouthed, let's go, and they headed for the door. Roy exited first, and Mary Jo glanced back before following. I caught her murmuring softly, I'm sorry, just before the storm door closed quietly behind her. Several weeks earlier, thwack, the effortless swing and graceful follow-through of Larry Cugg always left me envious whenever he gripped a driver. His consistently powerful tee shot often compensated for his subpar watch play and other shortcomings in his short game, allowing him to typically dominate our rounds on the course. We were at the driving range, both taking swings at a bucket of balls while engaging in light-hearted conversation. At this juncture in my life, I was yearning for the companionship of friends and some form of diversionary chatter and activity. Larry and I first crossed paths more than 10 years ago during our college days at UTU Chattanooga, where we shared a few classes. Despite maintaining a decent relationship since then, it wasn't until we both joined the same country club shortly before his marriage to Angela that we truly bonded. After receiving an invitation to their wedding, I reciprocated a year later by inviting them to ours when Jamie and I tied the knot. Since then, our friendship has deepened to the point where they've become one of our favorite couples to spend time with, sharing life's experiences and relaxing together. As he glanced up to watch his ball soar toward the 300-yard marker, he muttered, I'd dump the woman and metaphorically burn her at the stake. Fair enough, but how do you deal with the fact that despite her being unfaithful, deceitful, and dishonest, someone you've invested years of love into doesn't just vanish overnight or even over months or possibly years? I was grappling with my emotions here, having already accepted Jim's unfaithfulness and the impending dissolution of our marriage. Despite my anger towards God, as painful as it was, I still felt hurt. I had truly loved Jamie with all my heart, and to be honest, I still do, even after her betrayal. I just needed to gather insights from others whom I trusted so that I could make the necessary decisions without feeling so isolated. "I suppose simple," Larry responded as he placed another golf ball on the tee next to mine. He stood up to address me before focusing on the ball and continued, "Well, maybe not quite so simple. The poor guy might continue loving her to some extent for the rest of his life, but the wise man follows one of the fundamental economic principles. Never attempt to recover a sunk cost or invest more resources into a failing endeavor with the hope of returning to the initial state. It just doesn't happen." Pausing before swinging his driver, Larry inquired, "Why the sudden interest in unfaithful partners?" "You're not." "No," I responded quickly, and then fabricated, heard rumors about a colleague in my workplace that his wife might be having an affair with someone named Doug, and I was just pondering what advice to give him if he were to seek my opinion on it. So I'm consulting a few friends to gather their thoughts as I figure out my own stance. That is, if I choose to say anything at all, this explanation seemed to calm Larry. He simply nodded and focused on his golf shot, then executed another one of those flawless drives that filled me with envy. He cast a sympathetic glance my way as we all listened to Roy and Mary Jo's car starting outside at the top of the sloping driveway leading down to my house. Angela remained quiet, her gaze fixed on the center of the coffee table. The glasses left on the table had gathered condensation, causing droplets to form around the coasters, though they remained safely on the polished wood surface. Memories flooded back of Jamie fussing whenever moisture spots appeared on the furniture. Mama softly inquired if Dad wanted another beer, to which he declined with a shake of his head, offering me his own sympathetic look. The silence was broken by Angela's voice addressing me directly. "So, Clint, you're not just divorcing your wife, you're divorcing your friends too." Her tone wasn't outright accusatory, but it certainly lacked the support one might expect. "Angela, you and Larry are Catholics, correct?" I inquired, catching them off guard with the seemingly unrelated question. "Yeah, but what's that got to do with?" Larry started, his expression mildly confused. "Are you familiar with the Catholic concept of excommunication?" I asked. "Yeah, it's when the church excludes you," Larry began to explain. "No." I interrupted. "I may be just a Methodist, but even I understand that according to the Catholic Church, a member essentially excommunicates themselves by voluntarily abstaining from actions, thoughts, and practices that would typically maintain their full communion with the rest of the Catholic faith community." I leaned forward as I continued speaking. "Official excommunication by the church essentially amounts to publicly acknowledging that the individual in question has willingly distanced themselves from complete communion with the church from the outset. Drawing a parallel to divorce proceedings," I went on, redirecting the analogy to our current situation, "the court simply formalizes and publicly acknowledges that one or both parties have already disengaged from full participation in the marriage, and my legal action against Roy and Mary Jo." I clarified, "I am merely seeking formal recognition from the courts, and ideally as publicly and embarrassingly as possible, for those two individuals who voluntarily severed ties with my friendship through their actions. Both their direct involvement and their intentional negligence in addressing the circumstances that led to my divorce from Jamie." The rest remained silent for a moment, processing the information I had just outlined. The quiet was interrupted by the rustle of the next large envelope I threw onto the coffee table. Larry glanced up, catching the sorrow in my expression as our eyes met. His brow furrowed, a puzzled expression forming until he followed my gaze toward Angela. Noticing the tension in my mouth, Angela's expression shifted suddenly to one of fear as she darted her eyes between me and Larry, silently pleading. It appeared she had a sense of what might be inside that foreboding envelope. "Are you divorcing us as well?" Clint, Larry asked sorrowfully, his eyes moving between the envelope, Angela, and then back to me. I opened my mouth to speak, but my words faltered momentarily, and I had to blink back the beginnings of tears. I recognized the painless revelation would cause my friend, yet if I didn't proceed with my plan, I would be complicit like those I was confronting tonight. It would make me a hypocrite. "No," I finally replied, then cleared my throat and continued. Just her. I looked pointedly at Angela, who had closed her eyes and shook her head as if trying to reject what was unfolding. "What do you mean, just her?" What? Angela, clearly taken aback, could only manage a soft repetition of "No, no, no, I'm sorry, Larry," I said. "But you need to know with that." I pressed the remote to play the next recording in line. The sound of waves and the occasional seagull followed. Then the sliding patio door closing, presumably to keep the air conditioning in and the mosquitoes out. "Angela, hey girlfriend, why are you sitting out here all alone on such a beautiful evening? reflecting on how much you miss Clint pause, or how much you miss Doug, Jamie teased. Shut up, girl, came the sound of patio chairs sliding. I was just contemplating whether I made a huge mistake by confirming Mary Jo's suspicions about Doug and me. Angela, you mean you admitted it to her? Jamie inquired. Well, I just acknowledged it when she asked. She seemed to already have it all figured out, but she promised not to spill the beans, Angela replied, followed by a very audible snort. Yeah, right. Knowing Mary Jo's tendency to gossip, she'll probably spill it to Roy right away. And as for Roy, Jamie speculated, if that happens, I hope Roy sticks to the man code. What do you mean? Angela questioned. Roy won't tell Clint the truth, to prevent Clint from hating him for delivering bad news, Jamie explained. I hope your prediction is accurate, Angela paused. By the way, I haven't shared this with anyone else since you first confided in me about it when you and Doug first got together. Jamie, I appreciate that, girlfriend, although I suspect part of your motivation in assisting me is repayment for my support when your situation almost spiraled out of control. Oh, Jamie, trust me when I say I'm genuinely thankful for your help at the New Year's event at the country club. I don't typically drink that much, and if you hadn't assisted me in cleaning up after you found Javier and me behind the pro shop that night, Larry would have surely divorced me. He might have even uncovered the fact that Javier, as the club's CEO, had been arranging our meetings in the club's guest bungalows for almost a year. I switched off the recording. The background was filled with the chirping of crickets and the croaking of bullfrogs for the next 15 seconds. Then came the sound of Angela's breathing, growing heavier and louder as she neared the brink of breaking into sobs. Larry simply lowered his face into his hands as Angela approached, but refrained from telling her tormented husband. She murmured softly, struggling to articulate coherent sentences amid her surprise, and I could only hope shame. No. Larry, it's not, I mean, her words faltered. Is the transcript in here? Larry finally looked up at me, his expression thankfully not accusatory but rather devoid of emotion altogether. Yeah, I replied softly, along with a CDR containing the audio and an signed affidavit from my PI confirming its authenticity. Thank you, Clint, Larry said at last, offering a brief glance at his wife before rising and extending his hand to me. You're a true friend for letting me know. Don't worry about me being angry at the messenger. Let's go home. Angela, you'll need some time to pack, Larry said, as he headed towards the door, seemingly unconcerned about whether his current wife would follow. Angela glanced at me, her anguish over the impending loss of her husband mingled with fierce anger directed at me. Are you satisfied? She spat before turning to follow Larry out. I doubted she heard me when I quietly responded, No, not really. The previous week I had just explained my plan to divorce Jamie to Dad and Mamak Connie, asking them to keep it a secret until Jamie could be formally served. I assured them that my private investigator had provided ample evidence to support my case. I mentioned that I planned to serve her with divorce papers the following week and aimed to have her move out of our house as soon as possible after that. I thanked God for my grandfather's foresight in leaving the house solely to me before I married Jamie. I was only halfway through deciding what to do about our former so-called friends, so I refrained from telling my parents about that part. Reflecting on the past, I realized that Mamak Connie had been a wonderful companion for Dad following my mom's tragic death from a drunk driver when I was just 4 years old. Mamak Connie herself had endured loss, having lost her first husband in Operation Desert Storm in the 90s. She and Dad met at a dinner, and their relationship blossomed over a year and a half before they decided to marry. It's quite surreal to think about being the best man at a wedding when you're not even 7 years old yet. Dad and I often chuckled at the photos from his and Mamak Connie's wedding album, especially the one where there's a noticeable gap in the line of heads among the wedding party, which included me. Are you certain you two can't navigate through these regrettable circumstances? Clint, honey, Mamak Connie asked with genuine concern. Being unable to conceive children herself, and with me being her only child, I suppose she was desperately hoping to keep Jamie and me together long enough to fulfill one of her deepest desires in life, to have grandchildren who could help fill the void left by not having her own children. Regrettable circumstances, I pondered what exactly she was referring to. I had just informed her that Jamie had been having an affair with her boss for months that wasn't regrettable. It was intentionally disgraceful. I'm sorry, Mamak, I replied as tactfully as possible. If it had only been a harmless flirtation without becoming physical, and if she hadn't gone to such lengths not just to conceal it from me, but to enlist others to help cover up her infidelity, no, we're finished. I'm sorry, Mamak Connie rose to assist in tidying the living room, collecting the glasses left behind by my former close friends. She wiped down the coasters and neatly stacked them before heading back to the kitchen. As she left, Dad mustered the energy to address me with what he had been meaning to say. Well, son, you certainly severed ties here. You filed for divorce from Jamie, served 2 of your friends with lawsuits for alienation of affections, and 1 for aiding. Have I covered everything? I understood that he intended to convey the facts with a hint of humor, aiming to boost my morale. He likely believed he had imparted enough survival skills to me, both in the wilderness during my youth and emotionally through his guidance. The assurance in his expression suggested he was confident things would resolve positively. That's likely why he smiled and nearly dropped his beer when I handed him my final envelope, saying almost. It was now fully dark outside, with the beacon light atop Lookout Mountain flickering in the distance, accompanied by the distant glow of the city on the horizon. Reaching the top of the driveway, I headed towards my truck, intending to find a new bar to spend some time in away from home and enjoy a couple of beers. Glancing back at the house, I peered through the front picture window. Dad held the contents of the envelope in his hand, including the transcript of another conversation my private investigator had recorded during that eventful week at the Outer Banks. His expression conveyed a mix of disbelief and anger, while Mamak Connie's face reflected anguish and misery. I started the powerful Cummins diesel engine and drove away from the curb, unconcerned about leaving them at home. I knew Dad had a key and would lock up when they departed.